All right, diving in. This time you've sent us to the tip of the U.S., the continental U.S., that is, Key West, Florida.
Southernmost point, yeah.
And looking at what you all have shared with us is a really fun travel vlog in here, the Wikipedia page, obviously, even stuff from the city itself, their website, and then just a general overview. It seems like there's this mix of laid-back island life, but also this real vibrancy, like a lot going on.
Yeah, and you get a sense of that just from these sources, right? You've got the vloggers, they're kind of experiencing it firsthand, boots on the ground. Then you have Wikipedia and the city website to provide that broader context, the history, the facts and figures. So it's a cool blend.
So that's what we're going to try to unpack today. What makes Key West so distinctive? What are those key elements?
Exactly. And how do these different perspectives come together to paint that picture? Like, what makes this place tick?
Yeah, it's like a little mini puzzle.
It is. It is.
So if we're trying to get a feel for the place, I noticed the vloggers started with something pretty classic, like when you go to a new city, that kind of thing, the Conch train tour.
Makes sense, right?
You ever done one of those?
Oh, yeah, in a few cities, yeah.
It feels like a good way to get your bearings.
It is. It's a good intro. And in this case, it's a 75-minute narrated tour, and they're specifically focusing on Old Town Key West.
Okay.
So you're getting a sense of the history, the architecture right off the bat.
And they mentioned some quirky things that they noticed, like
Right.
the prevalence of metal roofs, which, I mean, you see those all over, and then these eyebrow houses. And now I have to ask,
Yeah. Eyebrow houses, I know.
what are eyebrow houses for anyone who hasn't encountered this term before?
So picture this. You've got your second story, your windows, and then there's this continuous low roof that kind of extends over them, almost like an eyebrow shading the window.
Ah, I see.
And it's not just for looks, it's practical. It helps deal with that intense Florida sun and keeps the interiors cooler.
That makes a lot of sense in that climate.
It does, yeah. You don't see that kind of design everywhere, so it adds to that unique look of Key West.
They also couldn't get over the number of chickens just running around,
Oh, the chickens.
which seems to have become like a Key West thing.
Totally. And they're not just strays. They're descendants of chickens brought over by early settlers. They just roam freely.
There's an acceptance of the chickens.
There is. It's part of the character of the place, right? One of those unexpected little quirks.
It's like, pigeons in big cities,
Exactly.
but chickens in Key West. Now, they also made the point that the conch train isn't just a passive thing. You sit there and you're driven around. It's hop on, hop off.
Oh, that's nice.
They said 4 stops in Old Town.
So if you see something intriguing, something catches your eye, you can jump off and explore it further.
Exactly. So you get some flexibility there.
Uh-huh.
And then they mentioned if you want to go further afield than those 4 stops, there's also the Old Town trolley.
Right. That covers a wider area and has even more stops. So depending on how much you want to see, you've got options.
All right, so we've gotten our bearings. We've seen the chicken.
You've seen the chickens.
What about the food? Because, when you go to a new place,
The food is essential.
that's a huge part of experiencing it. And I noticed, given how close Key West is to Cuba, no surprise, there's a lot of Cuban influence.
Huge influence, yeah. And this is where it gets interesting, that connection between geography and culture. That proximity to Cuba has shaped Key West in many ways, and the food is a prime example.
Okay.
The vloggers went straight for a classic Cuban sandwich at this place called the Key West Cuban Coffee Shop.
And they list all the ingredients: Swiss cheese, roasted pork, salami, mustard, pickles, lettuce, tomato,
It's a mouthful.
all on Cuban bread. They said one sandwich was enough for 2 people.
That gives you an idea of the portion sizes.
like I'm hungry.
Come hungry, exactly. That combination of savory fillings and the perfectly pressed bread, that's quintessential Cuban.
And then they also tried a place called El Saboni Restaurant, which is another popular Cuban spot. They had shredded beef and grilled fish there. Again, seems like big portions, served with rice, beans, and those sweet plantains.
Classics, yeah. Sounds delicious.
All right, so we've eaten, we've gotten a lay of the land. What about some of the more natural beauty? They visited the Key West Butterfly and Nature Conservatory.
Now that sounds really peaceful.
Yeah, they described it as a glass-domed enclosure, hundreds of butterflies just flitting about, different colors. They even had exotic birds and peacocks, red and scarlet they were named. But it wasn't just about the pretty sights.
No, there's an educational aspect to it.
Yeah, they said you could learn about butterfly biology, ecology, conservation, and they made a point of saying it's not just for kids.
Right, it's engaging for adults as well. So you're immersed in this lush tropical environment, waterfalls, and you're learning at the same time. It's a win-win.
And then they explored the historic Seaport, which seems like a real hub of activity.
Lots going on there.
Yeah, you can stroll along the docks, find places to eat and drink, watch the boats come and go, see some local wildlife. And they highlighted this daily event, the tarpon feedings. It happens at 4 p.m.
Tarpon feedings, that's cool.
They said that's when you can see these large, silvery fish leaping out of the water.
They're quite impressive.
And what's interesting is they actually saw a tarpon being fed later in the evening as well.
Oh,
So
really?
it seems like while there's a scheduled feeding, people are just feeding them at other times too.
Probably hoping to see them jump. And they're probably used to it by now, the tarpon. They know where the snacks are.
Right, they've got the routine down.
Exactly.
While they were by the harbor, they also saw the Whaling Wall, which is a series of murals painted on buildings.
Beautiful way to raise awareness about marine life and conservation.
They said it's really striking. And then, as a fun little side note, they walked past what used to be Jimmy Buffett's recording studio.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, now it's covered in stickers and tributes. So if you're a fan, that's a cool little landmark.
That's pretty cool.
Okay, let's talk history. Because Key West has a rich history, right?
Well, absolutely. It's shaped the island we see today.
The vloggers went to the Sails to Rails Museum. What did you think of that choice?
I think it's a smart one. It gives you a good overview of Key West's past. And a nice bonus, admission is often included with the Conch train ticket if you use it on the same day.
Oh, good to know.
The museum delves into those early days with a particular focus on the wrecking industry.
Which is something our general description really emphasizes, too.
Right, it was a major force in the 19th century. And just to clarify, it wasn't about intentionally wrecking ships.
Right, right.
It was more about salvaging them. Ships would run aground on those reefs around Key West, and the locals would be the first responders.
Yeah, rescuing people, salvaging cargo, it became a big part of the economy.
Exactly. It was risky, but potentially lucrative. And alongside that, Wikipedia lists fishing, turtling, and salt manufacturing as key industries.
Okay. And then the museum moves on to a real game changer. Henry Flagler's Overseas Railroad, built in the early 1900s.
An incredible feat of engineering. They built bridges and tracks across miles of open water to connect Key West to the mainland.
And, as the vloggers pointed out, part of the reason was to bring tourists down to Flagler's fancy hotels.
Right, he had a vision for Key West as a destination, but it also revolutionized travel and trade in general.
It put Key West on the map in a different way. But the museum also touches on the difficult conditions those workers faced building the railroad.
Yeah, and its eventual tragic end.
So going back to Wikipedia, there's more historical context. We learned Key West was once a major center for U.S. salt production.
From around 1830 to 1861.
Harvesting it from the seawater? That's fascinating.
It is. Sadly, the Civil War and then later hurricanes pretty much ended that industry.
Okay, and that Cuban influence we talked about goes way back too.
Oh, yeah. During the 10 Years' War in Cuba, many Cubans sought refuge in Key West, and some cigar factories even relocated there.
So for a while, Key West became a major cigar producer.
It did. And then the Great Fire of 1886 happened, which devastated many of those factories and homes.
Wow, that must have been a major setback.
It was. Some businesses moved to Ybor City in Tampa after that.
Which is interesting because that helped Tampa become a cigar center in its own right.
Exactly. It's like history kind of rippling out. But despite the fire, Wikipedia notes that Key West remained the largest and wealthiest city in Florida at the end of the 1880s.
So it bounced back pretty quickly.
It did, yeah. Resilient place.
Now, Key West also has a link to a really key moment in American history, which I have found fascinating. Yeah. The USS Maine.
Right, the ship that exploded in Havana Harbor.
Which, of course, led to the Spanish-American War. And it actually sailed from Key West just before that happened.
Oh, wow.
And even the U.S. Navy's investigation into the explosion took place at the Key West Customs House.
It really underscores the island's strategic importance.
It does, yeah. And then there's the Overseas Railway, finally completed in 1912. That land link to the mainland must have been a big deal.
Imagine, after being an island largely accessible by sea, suddenly you're connected by rail. That's a game changer for travel and trade.
And as the museum highlighted, that railway was largely destroyed by the Labor Day hurricane of 1935.
Tragic, but a reminder of the power of nature, especially in a hurricane-prone region like that. The damage was extensive.
But they rebuilt, right?
They did. The U.S. government stepped in and built the Overseas Highway, which is the U.S. Route 1 extension. It was a massive undertaking, and much of it was actually built on the foundations of those original railroad bridges.
It's incredible how they adapted and persevered.
It is.
Now let's talk about those classic Key West landmarks.
Gotta see them.
Gotta see them. The vloggers, of course, made sure to experience the sunset celebration at Mallory Square.
Oh, yeah, that's a must-do.
They said it's like a ritual, everyone gathering to watch the sun go down.
Those sunset views over the water are supposed to be incredible.
And then there's the southernmost point buoy,
The iconic photo op.
which, as they pointed out, and Wikipedia confirms, isn't actually the southernmost point.
Right, technically that's on a private property nearby. But the buoy is still a great symbol, and it's a popular spot for visitors.
And it says 90 miles to Cuba, which is interesting because the closest point is actually a little further, like 95 statute miles.
Ah, a bit of a discrepancy there.
But apparently, the distance from the buoy to Havana is closer to 90 nautical miles. So it depends how you measure it, but it's that proximity to Cuba that's so key.
Exactly. It's a defining characteristic of Key West.
The vloggers also took a stroll through Bahama Village, which sounds really charming.
Historically significant, too. It's where the first Bahamian settlers arrived back in the 19th century.
They brought their own culture and influences.
They did. And today, you see that reflected in the architecture, those pastel-colored homes. The vloggers said it's a beautiful area with lush gardens, and there are some great restaurants there.
Like Blue Heaven, although they did say be prepared to wait.
Which often means it's worth the wait.
That's usually a good sign. Now, in general, as you walk around Old Town, the architecture itself is really distinctive.
It tells a story.
It does. Wikipedia describes these wood frame houses, often 1 to 2.5 stories tall, built on piers.
Those piers are key.
They are. And they have those peaked metal roofs, horizontal siding, gingerbread trim, often pastel colors with covered porches.
It's a particular style, and a lot of those features are practical adaptations to the climate.
Makes sense.
Building on piers helps with ventilation and flood risk. Metal roofs are durable in storms. Those covered porches provide shade from the sun.
Creating those outdoor living spaces.
Exactly.
And then there are some truly historic buildings that have survived from the antebellum period. The oldest house, for example.
Built between 1829 and 1836, if I'm not mistaken.
And the John Hulling Geiger House, which is now the Audubon House and Tropical Gardens.
Stepping inside those must feel like stepping back in time.
Then you have the remnants of Key West's military past, like Fort Zachary Taylor and the East and West Martello Towers from the Civil War era.
Preserving those pieces of history.
And of course the Key West Lighthouse, now a museum, and the homes of famous figures,
Like Ernest Hemingway and President Truman.
which have become attractions in their own right.
Drawing visitors interested in the island's literary and political connections.
Even the Key West Cemetery is unique.
Above-ground tombs, a necessity because of the low-lying island environment. And they're known for having humorous or poignant epitaphs.
Some even contain the remains of those who died in the USS Maine explosion.
Wow, it's really layers upon layers of history there.
It is. So Key West has really cultivated a distinct identity, hasn't it?
Oh, for sure. It's got those memorable nicknames. The Conch Republic, southernmost city in the continental U.S.,
And the official motto is one human family.
which sums up the spirit of the place, welcoming and inclusive.
And that term conch itself has an interesting history. It originally referred to early residents from the Bahamas who were of European descent. Now it's used more broadly for anyone who calls Key West home. You even have the distinction between saltwater conch, meaning born in Key West, and freshwater conch for those who have lived there for 7 or more years.
It shows a sense of belonging, right? Like you're part of the community.
Yeah, it's your adopted home. And that Cuban presence, it's more than just the food and history. It's woven into the culture.
Absolutely. That proximity to Cuba, the immigration, it's all influenced the culture, the language you might hear, the feel of the community.
It's a great example of how geography really shapes a culture in tangible ways. And then there's that brief moment of independence as the Conch Republic back in 1982.
That's become part of their local lore.
It was a protest over a U.S. Border Patrol blockade.
But it really captured that independent, maybe slightly rebellious spirit, which is kind of part of Key West's charm.
So bringing us to the present day, there's the Key West International Airport,
Located in Newtown.
which is interesting because that part of the island was actually created by filling in salt ponds back in the 1950s.
So they literally expanded the island.
They did, and it's a major port of call for cruise ships, bringing in lots of visitors.
So they have to balance preserving the historical character with the demands of tourism and those modern needs.
And speaking of modern needs, the climate is something to consider,
Wikipedia classifies it as a tropical savanna climate.
with wet and dry seasons.
And of course, the vulnerability to hurricanes is always a factor.
They mentioned Hurricane Irma in 2017 and Hurricane Wilma in 2005.
Both had significant impacts on the island.
Reminders of the power of nature.
It's a reality for people living in that region.
And let's not forget the Naval Air Station Key West.
Major training sites.
So that military history is another thread throughout Key West's development. It adds another layer of complexity, doesn't it?
It does. You can't talk about Key West without acknowledging its strategic importance.
And even looking at the city news from March 2025 on their website, you see this vibrant local community. There's a new recycling mascot, efforts to honor women in history, recognition for the police and fire departments.
They're doing some good things.
They are. There's talk about historic preservation, urban forestry, affordable housing, a new community center, even the christening of a cruise ship.
It's interesting how those everyday news items reflect a lot of the themes we've been talking about.
Like what?
Well, you see a focus on community well-being, respect for their history, awareness of the environment, and the ongoing challenge of managing growth while preserving what makes Key West special.
And the sister city relationship with Havana, Cuba.
Another reminder of that enduring cultural connection.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Key West, it seems like a fascinating blend, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. You've got the history, from its maritime past to those Cuban links. The culture is lively, distinct, embodied by that conch spirit, and the natural beauty is just undeniable.
It's hard to resist those turquoise waters.
It is. And those sunsets.
So to sum it up, Key West today is the product of all these different forces, wouldn't you say?
It is. Whether it was built on the fortunes of the wrecking industry, the cigar factories, or its strategic military significance, all of that history has shaped its unique identity. And as we saw in the city news, it's still evolving, actively shaping its future while respecting its past.
It really makes you think about how tourism and history are so intertwined in a place like this,
Yeah,
and the lasting impact of cultural exchange across relatively short distances.
absolutely.
And I imagine the unique challenges that island communities face, especially when it comes to things like climate change and sustainability.
For sure. Those are ongoing conversations.
So hopefully this deep dive has sparked your own curiosity about Key West. Maybe you'll want to learn more about that Conch Republic moment or explore those efforts to preserve the island's amazing historic architecture.
There's always more to discover. Just start digging.
And that's what we encourage here at the Deep Dive. Keep those sources coming.
We'll keep diving.